Hello Hunters, my name is Dark Hero, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I'm going to be ranking every single weapon in both Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak. So no Axle Axe, no Tonfas, and no Magnet Spike. I'm still playing through Monster Hunter Frontier, I'll tell you how you can do it in a future video. Given how much Sunbreak has changed each weapon, and that many new hunters will finally be able to play Rise on PlayStation and Xbox, I'll be giving different rankings for both Monster Hunter Rise as well as Sunbreak. Now, I would say that I have a few dozen hunts with just about every weapon, with some going above the 300 mark, so I think I've got a good enough understanding of how they should be played. Now, the way I'm going to rate them is going to be a bit different, and this may actually be better than all the other tier lists I've done in the past. It's going to be based on each weapon's strength or how powerful it is, not from a speedrunner's perspective but more so a more casual to veteran player that does actually try to improve their hunts and go for better times, but doesn't necessarily reset the hunt and try to focus on trapping the monster and making sure that it doesn't move throughout the entirety of the hunt, as that really doesn't represent what the actual Monster Hunter game is like for most of us. And my final point going into this tier list is, well, how fun I feel like the weapon is. I also asked an AI to rank all of these different weapons and I was actually quite surprised by it, so stick around for the end of the video to see the results. With that being said, let's get started. Starting with, of course, the sword and shield. Its biggest strength is of course its versatility, being able to get in and out with very quick attacks that while they don't have a lot of reach, there's always a good tool for the situation you're in. You can use the sword combos to deal more damage, apply status as well as elemental damage, or you can use the shield bash combo to keep KOing and staggering the monster. Shoryugeki is its big flashy move. It's a silk bind that not only allows you to counter any incoming attacks from a monster, but it also deals a ton of damage and has great KO potential. In the base game of Monster Hunter Rise, this weapon was mostly used for the shield bash combo in combination with Shoryugeki, but given the buffs it has received since then, the sword combo has become more optimal. But of course you can do well with both. There's also the added benefit of having a shield, which means that you can be a lot safer with this weapon, and on top of that you can also consume items while your weapon is unsheathed, which isn't a big deal, but it can actually help you every once in a while, especially if you are a newcomer to the game. Don't be fooled by how simple the weapon is, there is a lot of skill expression to the sword and shield, so there's still a lot of fun to be had when it comes to mastering this weapon. Overall, I think I'm going to give Sword and Shield an A rating in both Rise as well as Sunbreak. Sunbreak really didn't do much to improve the Sword and Shield, the combos it added as well as the Destroyer Oil really didn't do much for the weapon, so if you liked Sword and Shield before in base Rise, you're going to like it just as much in Sunbreak. Next up is the Dual Blades. Once again, these weapons don't have a lot of reach, but they are able to unleash a variety of fast multi-hit attacks that can actually deal a lot of damage once it all adds up. Dual Blades are one of the weapons that is able to apply elemental damage the most, so you can definitely abuse that, and thanks to Monster Hunter Rise you now have the playstyle of also being able to play aerial Dual Blades, which is not only a lot of fun, but it's also incredibly powerful. Dual Blades are all about managing your stamina and your demon mode, gap closing to the monster and dealing as much damage as you can, while also being able to evade all incoming attacks with its many dashes including the Silkbind move Shrouded Vault. That being said, Dual Blades can get a bit repetitive after some time given that its combos are so short and limited. Thankfully Sunbreak did somewhat fix that, with the addition of the Silkbind move Spiral Slash, which deals a ton of damage and is now the focal point of Dual Blades in the expansion. Personally, I love the way Dual Blades are. They were some of my most used weapons in the base Rise game, and now one of my most used weapons in the Sunbreak expansion as well, so I'm going to give Dual Blades a rating of A for base Rise and S for Sunbreak. Next up is the iconic Greatsword. Being a slower weapon that requires some timing and precision, it's not too easy for beginners to pick up. That being said, thanks to shoulder tackle as well as rage slash, you're able to power through monsters' attacks while charging up your own to deal massive damage. Of course, if you're not using true charge slash, you're going to be missing out on even more damage. But that's a trade-off that you have to choose for yourself to see, would you rather land those consistent big hits with rage slash, or would you rather use TCS and risk getting hit by the monster, thus not dealing any damage at all. Because of the addition of Power Sheath in Base Rise, Greatsword now has access to a great movement option that will also boost your damage significantly. As such, Greatsword in Base Rise retains its classic playstyle while being incredibly powerful. If you were ever a fan of Greatsword in the past and you were good with it, you're going to be fantastic with it in Rise. Now with Sunbreak, that's when things changed a lot. Greatsword saw the addition of its very first counter, Strong Arm Stance, which you can do to immediately go into a true charge slash. Therefore, you're pretty much nullifying any risk that comes with using TCS. Sure, it does require 2 wirebugs to use the Silkbind move, but because it is so powerful and because it is considered a counter, it can be boosted by things such as Offensive Guard. It is just insanely strong. It is the thing that the whole Greatsword playstyle revolves around in the Sunbreak expansion. But if you don't like this playstyle, if you don't like the counter, you can play Greatsword as always. And there's also the addition of the Surge Slash combo, which is a fast multi-hitting combo for the Greatsword, which is something that we had never seen before. And while it isn't all that powerful, when it comes to fun, it is a lot of fun to use, and you have all of these different playstyles available to you now. And this is all for a weapon that, in the past, pretty much only had one reliable playstyle. So having said all of that, I think I'm going to give Greatsword both an S in Base Rise as well as an S in Sunbreak, but when it comes to power level, Greatsword has leveled up a lot in Sunbreak. After that is the ever controversial Longsword. Being the most popular weapon in the game by a long shot, Longsword has access to a ton of incredibly powerful moves. In Base Rise, it was the strongest melee weapon and it wasn't even a contest. However, the weapon was nerfed ever since, and the version that is going to be shipped with Base Rise for PlayStation and Xbox is going to come out with these nerfs already in place, so the weapon is not going to feel as strong as it once was. That being said, Longsword has a fantastic kit right off the bat. Being a weapon with a lot of reach that is easy to combo with, you pretty much only have to rely on your counters to get better with the weapon. And if you're not someone that is able to master the timing of the counters, like Foresight Slash for example, then you have access to Serene Pose counter, which is pretty much an automatic counter that uses 2 wirebugs, and you have Sakura Slash, which is a Silkbind move that uses 1 wirebug, but will also level up your spirit gauge. So with all of this, it is going to be quite easy to pick up and use the Longsword, and you're going to have a good time with it. Sunbreak ended up adding even more counters to the weapon, with things such as Tempered Spirit Blade or the Sacred Sheath, with Sacred Sheath being a counter that, if you time it right, does not consume any of your spirit gauge, but if you don't time it properly, it is still going to perform a counter, it's just that you're going to end up using one of your spirit gauge levels. So when it comes to being an easy weapon to pick up, it's even easier now. But then there's also the Silkbind move Harvest Moon, which was also introduced in Sunbreak, that creates an area around the hunter that makes it so that every single counter you perform within that area is going to deal a lot more damage by creating multiple hits. This seems extremely strong at first, but it takes a real master of the Longsword to use this properly, as you cannot leave the circle at any point, and if you do that, you're just going to cancel out the move. So if the monster ends up leaving the circle, you have no way to deal with them. Ultimately, I would say that the Longsword is a very fun weapon to use, it's just not as powerful as it once was, especially relatively to how strong it was in Base Rise before all the nerfs. After all of that, I think I'm going to give Longsword an A tier rating in both Base Rise as well as Sunbreak, but if you're someone that can take advantage of all of its tools, then the weapon is going to feel amazing for you. And now we have the lance, one of the most underutilized and underrated weapons in the entire game. While it fell short in comparison in base Rise to what it was back in Iceborne, I still feel like the lance has a pretty nice kit, having two different playstyles between using insta-block and countering or using dash attack. For the most part, it is a pretty reliable weapon that is easy to pick up and use, being able to block all sorts of incoming attacks and keep on poking out the monster. It may seem boring and underwhelming compared to other weapons, but it can feel very rewarding to master this weapon. There really isn't much going on with Lance in base Rise. It's all about using Encourage to counter a monster's attack and get a significant attack boost on your own, and then once again either use Guard Dash and keep spamming Leaping Thrust, or use Insta Block and follow it up with a Cross Slash. Sunbreak added some neat additions, such as Skyward Thrust, which is a pretty flashy move but isn't very consistent. More likely than not, you're not going to get the best out of the move and you're going to be missing out on some damage because you didn't hit the monster properly. Shield Tackle is a nice way to advance while still blocking some damage. And Sheathing Retreat is a very flashy move to get you out of some sticky situations, especially when it comes to big Nova attacks from the monsters that are unable to be blocked. Overall, I would say that Lance is probably the most consistent weapon in the entire game, but it's not the most fun, it's not the flashiest, and it's also not the strongest. For these reasons, I think I'm going to give Lance a B rating back in base Rise, but an A rating in Sunbreak because it has become more fun to use and also has become more powerful. Please don't get mad at me for this, I do love the Lance, it has now become on my top 5 most used weapons in Sunbreak, but this is generally how I feel most players are going to see the weapon. After that we have the Lance's counterpart, the Gunlands. And boy oh boy is this weapon incredible. Now Gunlands is very famous, or I should say infamous, for not being the strongest weapon in the game. In fact, it is often considered the weakest. Its damage scaling often leaves a lot to be desired, it's a weapon that has a lot of maintenance, and its playstyle may be somewhat difficult to pick up and use, given its different shelling types and what you have to do with the different gun lances, how to optimize its damage. Let's say that most of it isn't too intuitive, and you really need to watch Rurikan's crash course to get a good feeling for the weapon. The weapon has access to some very flashy moves such as Blast Dash, which was present back in base Monster Hunter Rise. However, even saying that, the weapon doesn't feel all that amazing to use, and more often than not, whenever I used Gunlands back in base Rise, it just didn't feel as good as some other options. However, in Sunbreak the weapon was buffed and it has become even more flashy and more powerful with things such as Bullet Barrage, Erupting Cannon and Reversed Blast. So now the Gunlance is an extremely mobile weapon that can go pretty much anywhere on the battlefield, all the while dealing a good amount of damage and just being an overall crazy playstyle. When it comes to flashiness, this weapon is an S tier, and I would say the same thing for fun. However, it's the other aspects of the weapon that I feel like aren't as good. It's a weapon that also takes a lot of skills to optimize their builds. And while the developers have added the option to now change the shelling level of your gun lances to make sure that every single one that you choose to use is at max level to get the most out of the weapon, you do need to be at Master Rank 140 to be able to do that, which is absolutely insane in my opinion. So no casual player is going to get there anytime soon. So as much as I want to put Gunlands in the S tier, I feel like there's a lot of factors that keep holding me back from putting it there. So I'm going to put Gunlands in base Monster Hunter Rise in the B tier and in Sunbreak in the A tier. It's a lot of fun, but you're going to struggle with a lot of things. Next up on the list is the Charge Blade, a hybrid weapon that can switch between a sword and shield and a giant axe. It is a technical weapon that requires careful management of its energy meter, called the file system, in order to deal maximum damage. Charging up your files, the Charge Blade's primary source of damage, may seem like a bit of a chore at first. However, it is very easy to do so, especially now in Monster Hunter Rise, with the addition of the Silkbind move called Counter Peak Performance, where you essentially can block any incoming attack, and by doing so, not only do you restore your files, but you are also able to follow that up with a super amped elemental discharge, therefore unleashing all of your files, dishing out a lot of damage. Or you can also follow up counter peak performance by simply charging your sword, your shield, or your axe. Although Charge Blade didn't feel very consistent when Monster Hunter Rise first released, the weapon has since received multiple buffs, not only making the weapon a lot stronger, but also making Charge Blade much more consistent, so you're able to land those files a lot more, therefore resulting in more damage. Alternatively, you can also play a different playstyle with the Charge Blade by using Spinning Axe mode, where you relentlessly attack the monster while dealing consistent damage. In Monster Hunter Rise, however, this playstyle isn't too encouraged, as you don't really have a defensive option nor a good way to keep this up throughout a long time. However, in Sunbreak, not only was Charge Blade buffed across the board, and elemental damage has been buffed as well, making the super amped elemental discharge playstyle a lot more effective with elemental file type Charge Blades. Spinning Axe mode has also been significantly buffed thanks to the addition of the new Silkbind move, Ready Stance, where you essentially are able to reset the animation of your attack, while also generating an extra file, allowing you to pretty much infinitely attack the monster in Spinning Axe mode. On top of that, this move also has a guard point, so you're also able to use it as a defensive option. If I were to rate Charge Blade as it was released in base Rise, I would probably give it a C tier, but after all of the buffs, I would rate Charge Blade an A tier weapon in base Rise and an S tier weapon in Sunbreak. It's a lot of fun to use, and there is a challenging component to mastering this weapon, which I think is going to feel very rewarding for players that are dedicated and put enough time into this weapon. After the Charge Blade, we have of course the Switch Axe. Switch Axe, as the name would indicate, is also a transforming weapon that allows you to swap between Axe mode and Sword mode. Monster Hunter Rise has made Axe mode feel a lot more rewarding, and you're actually encouraged to use it every once in a while and not just use Sword mode as much as you can. That being said, Sword mode remains the strongest form of these two, and once your Switch Axe is charged up all the way, your best course of action is to spam some sword combos. Monster Hunter Rise has done a lot for the Switch Axe, such as attaching yourself to the monster while performing a zero-sum discharge and making it so that monsters cannot knock you out of it. So the only way for monsters to cancel the animation is if they simply end up killing you. On top of that, you can follow up zero-sum discharge with the insanely powerful and extremely flashy Soaring Wyvern Dive, which deals a ton of damage and looks absolutely phenomenal. As for the Sunbreak expansion, well, it has made Switch Axe even more powerful and even more fun to use. One of its biggest additions is of course Elemental Burst counter. They actually gave Switch Axe a counter that not only does it deal a ton of damage, being by far the strongest tool in the Switch Axe's arsenal, it also charges up your Switch Axe. And when you combine that with the newly added Switch skill, the 2-stage Morph Slash combo, which replenishes some of your energy back whenever you swap between the two different modes, as well as having the Silkbind move File Charger, you're going to be able to have your Switch Axe in optimal condition for a very long amount of time. This is by far, in my opinion, the most fun and rewarding weapon to use in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. I loved Switch Axe in base Rise, but it is by far my favorite weapon in Sunbreak. There's nothing like it. I think it's pretty obvious how I feel about this weapon. I'm going to put it in S tier for both Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak as well. Now, the hammer is a slow but powerful weapon that can knock monsters unconscious with charged attacks. These charged attacks are the hammer's main source of damage. However, you need to be careful to manage your stamina properly, as charging your hammer does consume a lot of it. Thankfully, however, you're quite mobile with the hammer, a lot more than you would think by just watching some gameplay from it. You have many ways to close the gap between you and the monster, and using those gap closers effectively, as well as knowing when to charge your hammer, and using Silkbind moves like Spinning Bludgeoning, is going to make the difference in how effective you are with this weapon. In Monster Hunter Rise, they've also added 2 different forms or modes to the hammer, and swapping between these 2 forms does give you iframes, so abusing that as much as possible is part of the fun in mastering the hammer. That being said, as much as I love the hammer back in Monster Hunter World and Iceborne, I feel like it just isn't on that same level in Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak. It is still a lot of fun to use, don't get me wrong, and whenever you're able to keep on knocking the monster down consistently, especially with the newly added Silkbind moves in Sunbreak where you get to do extra hits on the monster, it is extremely satisfying to pull that off. However, I feel like the hammer is overshadowed in many ways by most of the different weapons in the cast, and is a weapon that is very simple to use, so I don't get a lot of satisfaction out of using it if I'm not just spamming KOs on the monster. So for those reasons, I'm sorry hammer mains, but I'm going to have to give hammer a rating of C in base Monster Hunter Rise and a rating of B in Sunbreak, because it did help hammer feel a lot more satisfying and also more powerful to use. Next on the list is of course the hunting horn. Now this weapon has undergone a huge amount of changes in Monster Hunter Rise. I was one of the 12 hunting horn mains in Iceborne, and this weapon feels a lot different compared to what it was in the past. It almost feels like it's a completely different weapon, something more akin to a combat horn if you will. You're able to play the melodies a lot faster, and you don't have to be standing there in the recital pose as you perform the melodies. In some ways it just feels like a different version of a hammer, which is going to be a lot more attractive for a lot of people, and of course this resulted in a lot of players picking up the hunting horn for the first time in Monster Hunter Rise. That being said, the weapon in the base game is not too powerful. It used to be really strong in the demo of Monster Hunter Rise, but it was nerfed, and ever since then it just didn't reach that same power level. Of course, if you're going on a multiplayer hunt, this is one of the best options when it comes to weapons to bring with you, as you're going to be able to buff your teammates. On top of that, you have a lot of armored moves, so it is also a weapon that is a good option to bring with you for some of the tougher hunts in the game. It has become even more satisfying and even more powerful to use in Sunbreak, having a Silkbind move that allows you to add extra hits and KO potential whenever you use this weapon. And I should also mention that because Sunbreak added the option of bringing NPCs with you to a quest through the follower system, taking a hunting horn with you also means that you're going to be able to buff those NPCs as well. So even if you're playing solo, the hunting horn is going to feel even more satisfying to use, in my opinion, in the Sunbreak expansion. Personally, I still miss the old style of hunting horn a lot. After all, that is what I was attached to in the past, and that is what I was the main of. But I still love the way that hunting horn has been handled in these games, and given how many new players have tried the hunting horn for the very first time, I think that it's safe to say that it is a very fun weapon to use. I'm going to be giving this weapon an A rating in both Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak as well. I almost put it in the S tier for Sunbreak, but it just didn't reach there in my opinion. It just needed a little help. Now we have the last of the melee weapons in Monster Hunter, the Insect Glaive. This weapon allows players to extract special buffs from the monsters by using their Kinsect, as well as being able to launch themselves into the air by using vaulting attacks. Given that the left trigger is the button that you use to actively select the different Silkbind moves of your weapon, if you have played with the Insect Glaive in past games and that was the button that you used to aim the reticle of the glaive, that might be somewhat confusing at first. You may have to change a few buttons around. Having said that, I was a huge fan of the weapon in World and Iceborne, but in the base game of Monster Hunter Rise, it just didn't feel as good. The weapon felt overly simple to use, and it didn't feel all that rewarding. There weren't many different playstyles available to you. Sure, you could play in the air or on the ground, but even so, there weren't many different options for you to use. However, Sunbreak changed a lot of it in my opinion. The weapon has become a lot more fun, not only by the addition of new Kinsect types, but also switch skills such as Kinsect Slash, that can be followed up with a Falling Thrust for a lot of damage and a very satisfying result. Gathering the extracts from the monsters has become a lot more streamlined, so the more clunky controls when it comes to aiming the reticle of the weapon are things that you simply don't have to worry about anymore. You still need to maintain the buffs, you still need to maintain the stamina of your Kinsect, but that is no longer a chore as it was in base Rise in my opinion. Honestly, the weapon has benefited a lot from the expansion. I haven't even spoken about all of the changes. The only negative thing I can say about the weapon is that it's not the strongest of melee weapons, but it is still a very fun and rewarding weapon to use that can also make a lot of hunts very easy because the monsters will simply not be able to hit you in the air. So if you're playing base Monster Hunter Rise, I would say that the Insect Glaive is a C tier weapon, but in the Sunbreak expansion I would rate it as an A tier weapon. After that we have the ranged weapon, starting with the bow. The bow is a weapon that allows for rapid firing of arrows and the use of special coatings to enhance those arrow abilities. With this weapon you'll need to maintain what is called the critical distance between you and the monster. However, because the bow is such a mobile weapon, you're able to quickly dodge any incoming attacks, while also boosting up the charge level of your weapon, which will result in even more damage. The playstyle can feel somewhat repetitive, but whenever you're able to dodge all of those attacks and just keep on relentlessly attacking the monster dealing a ton of damage, I feel like there's no way that the bow is not going to feel fun for you, unless you really dislike using ranged weapons. And again, you need to be somewhat close to the monster with the bow, so think of it more like a shotgun than a sniper rifle, if you will. Sunbreak did add quite a few things to the bow's arsenal, letting you essentially mark the monster to deal more damage on the part that has been marked by you, and also giving you the option to launch yourself into the air and essentially having access to the aerial bow playstyle. It's not the strongest thing there is, but because the bow is one of the strongest weapons in the entire game, that is the case for all the ranged weapons in fact, losing a little bit of damage to use the aerial playstyle is a worthy trade-off for a lot of players, myself included, because it is so satisfying and so much fun, and can also get you out of some complicated situations. Managing your coatings and making sure that you bring materials to craft those coatings in the middle of the hunt may be a little bit of a chore for some players, and that is the less fun aspect of the ranged weapons in general, but if you're okay with that, then I think you're going to have an amazing time with this weapon. I'm usually not a fan of ranged weapons, but I absolutely love the bow. As such, I'm going to be giving this weapon an A tier rating in base Monster Hunter Rise and an S tier rating in Sunbreak, because it has become even more powerful, even more satisfying, and you also get the amazing aerial playstyle. Now for the first of the Bogans we have the Light Bogan. As the name would indicate, this is a rather light weapon that allows for some fast movement and the ability to dodge somewhat consistently. Because of this, some players choose to use this weapon as a little bit of a supportive weapon by equipping skills such as wide range to help support the party, but don't misunderstand me, the weapon still deals a ton of damage. The Light Bogan may not be as flashy as its counterpart, the Heavy Bogan, but personally I enjoy the playstyle of the Light Bogan a lot more because you're able to essentially dash around the monsters while evading them and dealing damage from a distance, even to the point where you're able to counter and jump over the monsters while dealing damage. The Bogans have never been my favorite, but I'll say that the Light Bogan is fun to use every once in a while for me. Again, I have to respect the damage of the weapons, which is why, even though I don't think the fun aspect of the weapon is all that great, I think the power side of the weapon is going to increase its rating a little bit, which is reflected in its final rating of A tier in both Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak. And now for the final weapon we have the Heavy Bogan. I've somewhat spoken about this weapon when talking about the Light Bogan. Of course, it is the slower counterpart to the Light Bogan, being able to deal a crap ton of damage while also being able to equip a shield in case you need it. But let's be honest, when you're going to be able to use this weapon, more likely than not you're going to keep the monster down throughout the entirety of the hunt until it dies just a couple of minutes after. I have this problem with Heavy Bogans where I personally really don't like using them until I have a really powerful set with them, But at that point I don't like to use them too much because it really trivializes a lot of the hunts. But I do have to respect Bogan players because using heavy Bogan in a lot of the later encounters in the game, especially when it comes to anomaly monsters and the risen elder dragons, it means that if you're not careful you're going to get one shot, so there is that skill component. You need to be careful about your positioning, but if you know what you're doing you're going to feel like a god essentially. Sunbreak added a couple of new Silkbind moves that made the heavy Bogan a lot more satisfying to use in my opinion. Not only the counter but also the two different rings that you're able to use. One that increases the critical distance of your heavy Bogan, and the other one that results in simply more damage for the weapon. Combining that with the fact that you can turn the heavy Bogan into essentially a heavy machine gun that keeps on firing faster and faster, dealing a ton of damage all the way, there's inevitably going to be a good amount of players that enjoy this weapon. It's not for me, but I see the appeal in it, and I do recognize its insane amount of power. In the end, I would rate Heavy Bogan as a B tier rating for base Monster Hunter Rise because I feel like its playstyle was rather boring, and again, using this weapon before you have a final set doesn't feel all that good. However, Sunbreak has made the weapon a lot more fun and even more powerful, and you can use those rings I mentioned earlier in multiplayer, allowing other Heavy Bogan players to abuse them, which just feels satisfying and is good to look at, so that contributes to me bumping up the rating to an A tier in the Sunbreak expansion. As I stated at the beginning of the video, I asked an AI to rank all of these weapons, and here's the final result. As you can see, we're actually not too far off from each other on a few different places. Of course, it's worth noting that these weapon tier lists are rather subjective, especially this one as I added the fun component to the weapon. These will vary depending on personal preference and playstyle, but I feel like this is going to be somewhat consistent, especially for players looking to pick up these weapons, not only coming from past games, but new players as well. If you have enjoyed this video, then consider leaving a like, as these videos do take a lot of time. Thank you all so much for watching. My name is Dark Hero, and as always, happy hunting!